Good evening and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Corinne and I will be your moderator. We are excited to welcome Dr. Anthony Mennito as our speaker today. He will be discussing block materials that are critical to achieving CAD/CAM success. Before we get started, we do have a few reminders for you. At any point during the webinar, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A section of your control panel and we will answer them live at the end. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Ivoclar Vivadent. Dr. Mennito, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Corinne. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. I am in my office. I hope you are not in your office. I hope you've made it home and are sitting in front of your laptop with a cocktail. But we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about one of my favorite topics, CAD/CAM dentistry. I love it. Specifically, we're going to talk about the materials that you can use in CAD/CAM dentistry. So there's a ton of options nowadays. I think it's, honestly, I think it's the best time that there's ever been to be a dentist. When I was in dental school, we had this many options for crowns. We had PFM and we had gold. So basically you ask the patient, do you want it tooth colored? All right, you're getting a PFM. We could do feldspathic porcelain as well back then, but if in dental school, I asked my instructor to let me do a feldspathic crown, he would have laughed at me and said, shut up and do a PFM. So nowadays we have so many materials and they're so aesthetic and strong. And so that's basically what we're going to cover. We're going to cover all those options. So let's get rolling. I got a lot to get through. So this is me. I split my week between a medical university here in Charleston, South Carolina, and my private practice, not my private practice I work in, called Expertise Dental. And it's a really, really fun balance of being able to see patients and being able to teach dental students. And we're lucky enough at the Medical University of South Carolina to have a really nice CAD/CAM clinic where our students are doing single visit restoration. So we use a lot of this stuff. I'm teaching a lot of this stuff to undergraduate dental students. And it's super fun to see them learn and to get excited about what lies ahead in their careers. So just to let you know about some of the partnerships I have, some of the companies that I speak for, this particular webinar is sponsored by Ivoclar Vivadent. So we're going to focus on their blocks. And I think Ivoclar in particular has a big advantage over some of the other manufacturers in that they offer a lot of different material categories in blocks, whereas some other companies only offer maybe zirconia or glass ceramic or one or the other. They kind of have a little bit of each material for you to choose from, and they're all been around for a while. They're all very well tested in the market. And in research, and they all hold up very well. And that's part of what we're going to talk about is durability, because nobody wants to do dentistry that's not going to last. So we're going to talk about ways to maximize the durability of the dentistry that you do. But just to let you know that these partnerships exist for me. This picture that you're seeing exists in this very office. This is our block carrier. So like I said, I do CAD/CAM dentistry. It's one of my favorite things. I've been doing it for about 11 years now. I was a little bit of an early adopter into it. And I will say that what I have learned about what works and what doesn't work is a lot that I'm going to talk to you about here today. But the material that you see on the screen for me is my go-to number one choice when it comes to doing CAD/CAM dentistry. But we'll get to that. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. First, what I want to do is give you a little bit of background on CAD/CAM dentistry, just in case you're not familiar with it. So CAD/CAM is basically, and it's actually had a little bit of a bad reputation. I hear people talk about the fact that CAD/CAM dentistry produces ugly restorations, or they're not very aesthetic. They don't have great anatomy and things like that. And really, like anything else, it depends on the skill of the user to provide the artistry, right? The artistry and the anatomy and the proper design and things like that of CAD/CAM. So I'm going to show you some cases here today, and I'll let you judge what can be created by a CAD/CAM system. But the reality is, it it's every bit as good as what you could get from your lab, if not better, because in many cases I have the patient in the chair. Actually, all cases I have the patient in the chair, right? So I can match that shade perfectly. I can match that anatomy perfectly. So it's really, I think it's super fun, and obviously I get very excited about talking about it. But to give you a little background, CAD/CAM system basically consists of three things, sometimes four. An intraoral scanner. You got to have design software. You got to have something to create the shape of that restoration that you're making. And then you have to have a mill, right? The mill is what basically carves the restoration out of that block of material. And the three that are shown here are kind of the three major ones that are out there. ZIRC being the majority leader by a decent amount in that category. But they all work. They all have different pros and cons, and they all kind of have different material choices. So some of the materials that are available on one might not be available on all. So you really need to do a little bit of research before you figure out which one you want to go with if you're in the market for a CAD/CAM system. When we talk about material choices and what are available in blocks, basically it falls into these four categories. Glass ceramic is the one that is, I think, probably the most popular still. Glass ceramic includes emax, which is a fantastic material. We're going to talk quite a bit about emax moving forward, but zirconia is becoming more and more popular as a chairside option. And we'll talk about this as well. There are pros and cons to doing chairside zirconia versus doing lab fabricated zirconia. And we will talk about that. You also have your category of hybrids or composite blocks. These, once again, I would say across all these categories, there are pros and cons. There are things that are good about each material. There are things that might be not as good about them. So that's really when it comes down to picking a material, you got to weigh the pros and the cons for any given case that you're doing to try to come up with the best solution for that given patient. And I think that's a big part of what I want to accomplish here tonight. These composite blocks have a small but yet really nice niche in the workflows of what we do every day. So we'll look at that. And then PMMA. PMMA is basically acrylic, right? It's basically the powder liquid that you remember from dental school. Maybe you still use acrylic a little bit for denture fabrication and things like that. But this PMMA block is made under ideal circumstances. So it's a very strong, very durable material. And we'll talk about when you might use that in your practice. There are also some things that you might not think about. These blocks all come with different attachments depending on the mill that you're using. So a pmma mill attachment is different than a program mill attachment is different than a CEREC attachment. So it's important, and this is important for your staff as well, who's going to be doing most of the ordering in your practice. Ask me how I know that this is important. They need to know that there are differences in emax across the different mills. So when they hop on Henry Schein's website to order, they know to order specifically for the plan mill or your MCXL or whatever mill that you have. These blocks also come in different sizes, and there are C14 is, I think, probably the most popular size. But the one on the lower left, the I12, is also relatively popular. So those two sizes are kind of the two mainstream ones. But depending on what you need, you need to have the right size block for that. So just important to have that information. And then the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to CAD/CAM systems is an oven of some sort. And this is Ivoclar's brand new CS6, and this is a game changer as far as post-processing goes. So for glass ceramics and zirconia, those tend to need a little bit of post-processing in order to get them to their final strength, their final color, their final finish, basically. And so we'll talk about what the CS6 brings to the table that previous ovens have not, or furnaces. Some people call them furnaces. I call it oven. I think of it like, oh, I'm going to put these brownies in the oven to cook. My patients always get a little chuckle about their crown going in the oven for 15 minutes. So I just generally refer to it as an oven. And then the last thing we need to know is we have this beautiful restoration that we've created on our CAD CAM system, how are we going to put it on the tooth? So cementation, we're going to talk a little bit about that because this is always something you have to have in the back of your mind when you're doing a restoration. How am I going to put it on the tooth? Am I going to bond it? Am I going to lute it? All right, these terms we'll discuss and the differences there as well. So we always talk about flexural strength when it comes to materials. And to be honest, in the research world, and I've done a fair amount of research, flexural strength is not really a clinically relevant strength, but this is the one that for whatever reason that manufacturers will talk about. And this gives you just maybe a general idea of the overall strength of the material, but in reality, for clinical relevancy, fracture toughness is a better measure of how resilient a material is going to be in a patient's mouth. So when we look at these, we've got feldspathic, we've got Empress, we've got emax, and we've got zirconia. And you can see next to zirconia, we have a pretty good span of strengths, right? And you'll see next to the zirconia crown itself, I have 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y. And we're going to talk about the differences in zirconia because all zirconia is not the same. So you really need to understand the differences that we have in zirconia so that when you're either milling something in your office or you're sending out to a laboratory for that zirconia, you know exactly what you get. You know that it's going to hold up for whatever given situation that you're going to use it for. And so that's just a really important aspect of material selection that I think all dentists need to know about because a lot of us are using zirconia for a lot of restorations nowadays. It's a very, very popular material. But really what I wanted you to get out of this slide is that fracture toughness is a really important clinical trait, and that zirconia has a vast range of fracture toughnesses depending on the composition of that material. We'll talk about that. But for me, there really is one material that you can build a digital practice around, and it is emax. And it is more specifically bonded emax. And we'll talk about that a little later. But I bond almost all my emax into place. I have a certain philosophy that revolves around doing really conservative dentistry. And so I do crown preparations that don't have really much in the way of retention and resistance form, where I'm really relying on bonding of that ceramic to the tooth structure for retention. But I love emax for a few reasons. One, it's incredibly efficient. I book, for the most part, 2 hours for every CAD CAM restoration, and there's a lot of times when we finish early, and I can go drink a cup of coffee before my next patient. It is a really efficient workflow, and we'll talk about the specifics of that. It's gotten even more efficient with the introduction of Ivoclar's CS6 oven. By the way, we'll talk about the specifics of that. It's a really aesthetic material. You get choices of translucencies. You have basically a whole shade range that you can select from. So you have basically everything for every possible clinical scenario that comes through your door. And I'm going to show you some restorations, and I'll let you be the judge as far as what you think the aesthetics are of this material. And then longevity. This material has been out for like 15 years now, and we have really good clinical data looking at how this material is held up in actual patients' mouths in specific situations. And you look at almost all the studies, and it's greater than 90% success rate over the course of 10 plus years. So we're getting really good results with this. So you can use this material with confidence in your patients' mouths. The one thing that I really want to emphasize, and this is part of what we'll talk about a little later, is the difference between adhesive cementation and conventional cementation. And the difference is that when you adhesively bond a crown to a tooth, it actually supports the ceramic more, and it increases the strength of the tooth. So you don't need as much thickness of material when you're bonding a glass ceramic or a zirconia crown to a tooth than you would if you were just using a resin modified glass iron or cement. So if we look at Ivoclar's instructions for use for emax here, you can see that for adhesive cementation, we just need a 1 millimeter thickness of material on the occlusal surface versus a conventional cementation preparation where we need at least 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters. So, you have to be thinking about how you're going to deliver this restoration when you're prepping the tooth, so you know how much reduction you need to perform. So what are some of the benefits of bonding ceramic? We already talked about the fact that it allows for conservative preparations. We don't necessarily need 4 mm walls with 6 degrees of taper and all that, retention and resistance form like we were all mostly taught in dental school. I would get kicked out of dental school now for the restorations that I do in my practice because they have no retention and resistance form for the most part. So we can really save a lot of tooth structure by bonding our ceramics to the tooth. It also increases the strength of the ceramic, as I talked about. That ceramic is supported by the resin cement, and it increases the strength. And it allows for flexibility of fit. So if you have an area, if you're bonding to enamel, if you have enamel margins all around your preparation, and you have a gap of 120 microns, most of us might look at that and say, "Oh, I've got an open margin. I'm going to send it back to the lab, or I'm going to remill it." But the reality is, when you're bonding to the tooth structure and you're able to bond your resin cement to both the glass ceramic or the zirconia and to the enamel margin, you've got a really durable situation there. And that resin cement is not going to wash out. It's going to stay there for the long term. And studies have shown that is the case. And then if you look at some studies and older studies done in the Journal of the American Dental Association, it basically concluded that bonding has been shown to increase clinical success. And if that's not our goal for our patients, then we're not doing dentistry the right way. Our goal in the end needs to be to increase the clinical success and make sure that the restorations that we do for our patients are lasting a long time. So here's just one example of one of those studies that I pulled up, where they looked at 103 bonded occlusal overlays. So these are really conservative emax occlusal overlays, basically tabletop type preps, where they followed 103 restorations, preps that look like this, basically, where you're bonding to a lot of enamel, and they found 100% survival rate for an average of 8 years. So really good durability when you know your material and you know your cementation and bonding protocols. You can really have successful results. Now, emax comes in a lot of three different translucencies, actually: high translucency, and I use high translucency mostly for inlays and onlays. These blend in very nicely with the tooth structure. You can see we have a good range of shades that are available for this material in the HT block, LT block, which is low translucency. And I like these when I'm trying to match a zirconia crown in the anterior or a PFM, because that low translucency has that same level of opacity. Also to mask a dark prep. And I also like these a lot for implant abutments. I make a lot of custom abutments. And when I have those cases, I'm able to mill an emax crown. I always use low translucency to block out the metallic of the titanium abutment. So LT comes in very handy in a lot of cases. And then medium translucency for basically everything else. I think these are the prettiest blocks. I love these for anterior crowns. I'll show you a case where I did an MT anterior. However, they are available only in limited shades, as you see, the A shades, B1, and some bleach shades. So unfortunately, hopefully we're getting more shades from Ivoclar for MTs here in the future. Let's talk about a couple of different cases. And I'm going to start with, this is my crown prep. This is that tabletop crown prep where we're trying to keep a lot of the strength of the tooth by preserving the biorim. The biorim are basically the axial walls that you would normally cut away to get retention for a conventional crown prep. Here is what milled emax looks coming out of the plan mill. I have a plan mill in my practice. And here it is after it's been stained and glazed and fired in the oven for about 15 minutes. And this is a bonded emax restoration. Once again, you can get really good aesthetic results with this material with just a little bit of effort. Learning how to stain and glaze is a nice thing to be able to do, to train your assistants to be able to turn your crowns into something that looks like it belongs in the mouth. Here's another case where the patient came in, she was having some biting pain in a very specific area. And as we look at this tooth, we can see there's some fracture lines adjacent to these amalgams. And we see this all the time. Like, how many times do patients come in to your office and they have amalgams and fracture lines adjacent to them. Well, in this case, when we got the amalgam out, we were really able to identify the particular part of the tooth that was weakened under the stress of both occlusion and that amalgam, and it was just that distobuccal cusp. So we ended up doing an onlay, and through that, scanned it with my intraoral scanner, threw it in the design software, designed an onlay, and in under 2 hours, sent the patient out with a really pretty restoration. This is a high translucency emax restoration. You can see how well it blends in to the adjacent tooth structure with just a little bit of staining and glazing. I don't spend 10 minutes staining and glazing. I spend 2 minutes staining and glazing. I just like a little bit of that to make it look like it belongs in the mouth. Here's an anterior case. Patient came to me with a broken veneer on number 8. And this is, they always say single central is the hardest thing to do. I love a good single central. With the design software that I have, and I love taking intraoral photos of these to really be able to study the characteristics of the teeth, through this into my design software. And in under this honestly, this took me about 2.5 hours to do. So this took me longer than 2 hours. And I always schedule more for single centrals because you never know that you're going to need a little extra time for maybe a second fire. But look at this result. I mean, this is a beautiful, beautiful case. Was really pleased with this. The first veneer that the patient had, she was a physician. She at the time when she was getting the dental work done, she was in New York doing her residency. But she's originally from LA, and her dentist was in LA. So she flew across the country twice to get that veneer. And so she was blown away by the fact that I could do this in a single visit in under 3 hours. So this is the kind of thing that you can really build your practice with if you're able to do this kind of dentistry. And I love this because ugly teeth need love too, right? So we had number 10 that had root canal treated. It had a large composite in it. It's not a pretty case, but this is one of my favorites because, we got to make this tooth look camouflage and make it look like it blends into this patient's mouth. And we were able to do that. Actually, this was a super fun case. So emax is very versatile. I love it in the anterior. I love it for cases like this nowadays when I'm doing what are called screw-mentable restorations, where we have a laboratory make a custom abutment for us. They will design the crown. They will send us that crown design, and we can mill an emax restoration, almost always screw retained in our own mill, and it really saves us a lot of money. So this is the screw-mentable solution. When we have these, the responsibility of marrying the emax crown to the abutment falls on me as the dentist. So this Multilink hybrid abutment cement is my go-to. You can see the yellow stripe. It says HO, and HO is high opacity. So you basically have something that helps you to block out the metallic look. Because emax even the low translucency emax is relatively translucent material, right? It's a glass ceramic. So sometimes you need a little bit, depending on the thickness of your crown, a little bit of help to block out that metallic look of the tooth. So the Multilink hybrid abutment cement works really, really well for that. And this was that case that I showed you a minute ago in the mouth. Turns out really nice. And super efficient workflow. Usually I can turn these cases around in about a week. Sorry, there's some ambulances going by outside the office. Hopefully you can't hear that. All right, so let's talk about the in-office workflow for emax. So, you're going to prep your tooth, you're going to do your scan, you're going to do your design, and then you're going to mill it. And then once you try it in the mouth, you're going to need to crystallize. And if you determine you want to stain and glaze, you're going to do that in the same step. And for emax with the new CS6 oven, that process only takes 11 minutes. In the oven that I have here in my office, it takes about 15 minutes. So you're knocking 4 minutes off that process. And that may not seem like much, but it is. All right. 4 minutes really adds up. And, when you have a patient in the chair and you might have people in the waiting room waiting on you, your next set of patients, 4 minutes is a long time. So this is really nice to make what was already an efficient workflow even more efficient. So let's move away from emax and talk about Empress. Empress is a little bit of an older material, but it is, I think, the prettiest material that we can mill in our mills nowadays. And so for really aesthetic cases, Empress, and specifically this block that you see on the screen, Empress Multi, is my favorite block. It is beautiful, y'all. There is a built-in gradient in this block that basically makes it look just like a natural tooth. However, this material is quite a bit weaker than emax. So just like before, we have to know our material and know how to prep for that given material. And I love Empress Multi for anteriors, but I also really love Empress Multi for small onlays in the posterior. But you can see the prep guidelines here. For anteriors, we need 1.5 millimeters reduction. For posteriors, we need 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters, and you must bond this material to tooth structure, must be bonded. So here's a case that we did quite a few years ago, actually, with Empress. And this is a patient who came in with some of the worst composites that I've ever seen done on a human being. These are truly horrible. But we figured at this point we could do no wrong, because you're only going to improve this situation, right? So for Empress, because we need a certain amount of thickness, and because the patient was partially edentulous in the posterior, we wanted to give ourselves plenty of ceramic thickness for this preparation. And so you can see it's a pretty aggressive prep. You wouldn't prep this aggressive for emax, but for Empress, and this was a few years ago, and this was a dental student who did the case. This was our preparation. And this was our final result on that lateral incisor number 7. So Empress with the built-in gradient, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of love, a little bit of staining and glazing, really is a beautiful, beautiful restoration. One of the advantages about doing Empress in the posterior is that we don't have to stain and glaze it. We don't need an oven cycle. We can simply hand polish those straight out of the mill, which takes just three or 4 minutes, and deliver those directly. So that is an incredibly efficient workflow that we can use for small posterior restorations as well. And even in a case where a patient maybe in the posterior is opposing a complete denture or a partial denture, where the chewing forces aren't going to be so great, Empress is a really, really nice option there as well. So like I said, Empress has this built-in gradient. Basically, you get more translucency in one end of the block and more chromatic, more chroma in the other end built in. And so within your milling system, you can determine where within that block you want to position your restoration. Do you want it more towards the translucent end? Do you want it more towards the chromatic end? Gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of control over that final restoration. And once again, I have anterior only here. You can use it for small restorations in the posterior. You just have to pick your spots depending on the occlusion. It must be bonded, though. Absolutely must be bonded to tooth structure, because it's just not strong enough to hold up on its own. If you want to do a stain and glaze cycle for Empress, and we did in that case that I showed you, and you likely would for single unit anteriors. You may not have to for multiple units where you're controlling the smile yourself, but that cycle takes about 20 minutes. So it is a little bit of a commitment, but with the result that you get, your patients aren't going to mind sitting in the chair a few extra minutes, because this is a truly, truly beautiful restoration. So can you bond to these glass ceramic materials? And the answer is absolutely. And I'm just going to talk briefly about how to do that. You have to treat the ceramic, you have to treat the tooth, and then you have the cement that you're going to use to bring the cement or the ceramic and the tooth together. Okay, so the first thing you need to do with any glass ceramic is you need to etch it with hydrofluoric acid. Now, be very careful with hydrofluoric acid, because it's a dangerous material. You always want to handle it with gloves. And if you're your assistant or one of your team that's handling it, make sure that they are well trained on it, because if they get it on their skin, it's nasty, nasty stuff and difficult to neutralize. So hydrofluoric acid, usually 9% is what is sold. And for emax, you only bond it for you only etch it for 20 seconds. For Empress, you need longer. You need 60 seconds for Empress. So there's a little bit of a difference there. These are totally different materials, so you got to treat them different on the front side. But only 20 seconds for emax. 20 seconds, you have to have that clock either running in your head or physically have a stopwatch next to you to count those seconds. It's really important not to over etch or under etch that material. 20 seconds is the sweet spot. And then you need to silanate that material as well. And what silane does is it basically is a coupling agent that allows the resin cement to stick to the glass ceramic. And this is a really important step as well. I've seen people who will take silane and they will dump it in the crown and then just let it evaporate. That is a bad idea. You want a very thin layer of silane, 1 or 2 layers, and that's all. You don't want a thick coat, because if you have a thick coat of silane, it's going to compromise your bond strength. So you want to just take a micro brush, put a little silane on it, scrub it on the crown for, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 seconds, just one coat, right? Scrub it on all over and then set it down to evaporate. After 60 seconds, if there's any left in there, you can air dry it, and then you're ready to roll. Okay. On the tooth, you would use whatever bonding agent it is that you use, and then you would use your whatever your cement is. Now, I have here selective enamel etch, and that's a really important thing to remember about universal adhesives. If you look at all the literature on universal adhesives, they bond really well to den, but they don't bond as well as they need to enamel, unless you phosphoric acid etch that enamel. So you're selectively phosphoric acid etching any enamel that you have in that restoration, and you're going to really increase your bond strengths to enamel with a universal adhesive. So just something to keep in mind. It's a bonus tip. All right, now, what if your emax preparation is retentive? It's the kind of prep that they taught us in dental school, where we have 1.5 millimeters of thickness, we have 4 millimeter walls, axial walls, and we've got ideal taper. You can absolutely use an RMGI cement like ZirCAD cement to put that restoration on. Only for emax though, not for empress. Empress must be bonded. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, let's switch gears and talk about composite blocks. This is a different type of material now. And these are sometimes called hybrids because some of these materials have a little bit of zirconia or silica in them. So they're considered technically a ceramic or a nano ceramic. I like these materials for only a few indications. One would be an onlay. I do these for onlays. There are some times when I'm working in a patient's mouth and we've got this big cavity preparation, and basically the tooth is treatment planned for a direct restoration. And I take a deep breath and I say, I don't really feel like building this up little by little, 2 millimeter increments with my direct composite. I'm just going to scan this patient and mill something and charge them for the direct restoration. I do that quite a few times just because I feel like I can give them a better result that way. It takes a lot of the stress off of me for doing that direct restoration. And it's everybody ends up happy in that scenario. The other thing that we use this for, and I was surprised when I did the first case where I was doing no prep veneers with these composite materials, but these hand polish really, really nicely, especially Tetra CAD. And we do these no prep veneers, and we can mill these composite materials very, very thin, like 0.3 millimeters basically, and not have to really do much in the way of adjustment after the milling process. And these are really pretty. We have a decent number of cases out there of these types of materials, and so that can be a nice option as well for composite veneers. Once again, the benefit of these is that you have shorter appointment times, because you wouldn't put this in the oven. If you put this in your oven, it's going to melt. So don't do that. Okay, shorter appointment times. We have the ability to repair them. So if we have an onlay and we get a decay at a little part of one margin, we can just repair that margin instead of removing the entire restoration, like maybe we would have to if that were a ceramic material. And like I said, we can mill these very, very thin, which is nice. Some of the disadvantages are the block costs every bit as much as a block of emax, so you're not really saving money on those. So I really have to kind of convince myself to burn a block on a case when there's a big MODBL direct composite that I'm charging the patient for. Not easily characterized. So where we would stain and glaze emax and empress, we can't really do that with these materials. and you cannot use them for full coverage. As much as we might want to do crowns with these materials, the modulus of elasticity, the flexibility of these materials is too high. And so what happens generally over time is because they're flexible, they just kind of break down the bond. And we've had, at least anecdotally, a lot of cases where full coverage crowns done with these types of materials have debonded and needed to be redone. So just a caveat there if you're thinking about doing full coverage with these. And the other thing is water absorption. So composites are known for their propensity to absorb moisture from the oral cavity, and these materials are no different. And what is sort of being discovered now about these materials is that the strength of them is pretty good early on in their lifetime, but as they absorb some of this moisture, that strength can decrease kind of slowly over time due to that water absorption. And the same is true for direct composites. So that is one negative of this material. So here's a case where the patient came in with a fractured distolingual cusp and a couple of existing amalgams in the tooth structure. A lot of times when I do these, I'm kind of a softy and maybe not the best business guy. So patients will come in, maybe they can't afford a crown, and I'll say, all right, we'll do a direct composite on this, and I'll do what, like I explained before, where we end up taking away the weakened parts of the tooth, and we end up milling a composite to fill in. This is an example of an onlay that I did for a patient many years ago. And these hold up very, very well. You have to understand how to bond these materials into place. So understanding that process is really important. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. Here's another case of a large amalgam getting taken out. And you can see that buccal amalgam as well. We're talking about that molar there. Once the amalgam's taken out and all that decay and the underlying tooth structure was removed, this is what we were left with. And I treatment planned this for a direct rest composite. And I looked at this and I was like, it was like at the end of the day, and I was like, oh man, I just don't feel like dealing with this. I'm just going to scan it and mill it and use Tetra CAD for this, and ended up getting a pretty nice result. But the benefit of this versus direct composite is these materials don't shrink, right? So we know that our materials we place 2 millimeters at a time or 3 millimeters or whatever we do, when we polymerize those, we get polymerization shrinkage. And that is probably the worst characteristic of any direct composite. Well, these materials are pre-polymerized, right? So there's no shrinkage to these. So that is an advantage of these over direct composite. And this was that case. And you can see they blend in really, really nicely at the margins. You can't really tell where that restoration stops and the tooth begins. So this was a nice result. We ended up doing the same thing on number 15 right behind it a few weeks later. So those are composite blocks. They're kind of niche materials, but there's definitely a place for them in your practice. And then PMMA, which is really a niche material. This is acrylic for all intents and purposes, but once again, created in a more ideal environment where you've got ideal pressure and there's no voids, or there's no porosity in this PMMA. It's a really strong, durable material, and basically the only thing that I use these for are long-term temporaries. So this is a really niche material, and so a case like this where we had a patient who, for financial reasons, she needed a bridge. I think her daughter was getting married, and she was embarrassed by this edentulous space she had that showed when she smiled, but she couldn't afford to pay for the bridge. She had to kind of do it little by little in increments. So what we agreed to do, because she's a sweet old lady, and you know what, she would bring me baked goods every single appointment, and that is honestly the way to my heart. If you want to take complete advantage of me, bring me brownies or a red velvet cake, and I'm a sucker for that. So she would bring baked goods in all the time, and so we decided to do this case and put her in a long-term temporary. And this was old school CAD CAM technology here, where we prepped the teeth, we marked the margins. This was and here was our initial design for our PMMA. We milled that out. Okay. And the one thing about anytime you mill bridges, so this is one thing I wanted to hit on briefly. You mill a bridge, you got to be really careful about connector thickness. And if we all want them to look nice, Sometimes we'll use a disc to open up those embrasures, but you got to be really careful because the occlusion is coming down generally on those marginal ridge areas. And if you go haywire with your disc into those embrasures, you can really cause some issues. So this was a case that we milled at a Telio CAD. We only had one shade of Telio CAD at the time, and so I really needed to basically stain and glaze this using what I'm showing you here, air braiding the tooth, put some tints and some flowable, and basically try to make it look as much like the patient's dentition as I could. And as I held this in my hand, after I did it, I was like, this is hideous. And then we ended up trying it in the mouth, and it looked pretty darn good. So PMMA could be a good long-term temporary. This was in her mouth for almost a year and held up absolutely really well. So that's an option for you as well. And then I got to talk about zirconia. So I'm running a little behind here, so I'm going to try to catch up. But zirconia is really hot material, obviously. If you don't know much about zirconia, people call it zirconium. Sometimes zirconium is actually a metal. They mix that metal with something called yttrium oxide to create a ceramic, which is zirconia, ends in an A. And one thing that's important to understand about zirconia is that it comes in all different flavors, basically. We got 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y. And these are characterized by how much yttria is in that concentration. And so what's important to understand is that 3Y is the original formulation, which was really strong, but really kind of ugly. This was our original Bruxer crown. And these were super strong. So that's the original formulation. And then people wanted them to look, we want our zirconia to look prettier. So we added more yttria to it. And what that did was it increased the translucency. It made them a little prettier, but it also weakened the ceramic as well. And then we added even more yttria to get 5Y. And the same thing happened, right? They got a little bit prettier, but the strength of the material went down. So this is really important to understand that you can't just write your lab technician and say, I want zirconia bridge, 4-unit zirconia bridge, because then you're at the mercy of whatever they want to give you. So it's really important to know those materials. And then there are newer materials like ZirCAD Prime, which are a blending of different types of zirconia. They can actually layer different types to get strength in certain areas and aesthetics in others. So it's a really exciting time for dental materials. But like anything else, you got to know your material. So the two blocks that Ivoclar has for zirconia are ZirCAD Multi, all right? Multi being just like Empress Multi, where it's got a built-in kind of gradient layer in it. This is the prettier of the two zirconias. And remember, prettier means weaker when it comes to zirconia. So if you look at the prep guidelines, you need at least 1 millimeter of prep in the or ceramic thickness in the posterior. ZirCAD LT is kind of their basic 3Y zirconia, and this is the one when you're doing a second molar on a patient who bruxes, this is the material you're going to mill out. So you can see that you only need 0.6 of a millimeter of ceramic thickness for that. So really important to know which material is which. Now with the CX6, this is maybe the most exciting thing that this oven does, and that is how it handles the sintering of zirconia. So for ZirCAD LT, the sintering time is 22 minutes. Keep in mind, if you were to send out to your lab technician for a zirconia crown, they're going to sinter the same material for 9 hours. All right. You're able to do this in your office in 22 minutes. That is incredible. If you want to add an additional stain and glaze cycle, that is going to be additional time as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, ZirCAD Multi is that more translucent, prettier, multi-layered material. So this is your more aesthetic option. And so being that it's more aesthetic, and that's the expectation, it's going to take longer to sinter. Generally, the longer you sinter zirconia, the more translucent and the prettier it gets. There is an advantage to this oven that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And like I said before, if you want to do an additional stain and glaze cycle, that's another 15 minutes. The nice thing about the CS6 is it's got a vacuum integrated within it, and it basically is able to remove porosity from the zirconia. Remember, anytime you create any sort of ceramic, there's always a little bit of porosity in that composition, and the CS6 is able to remove the porosity from the zirconia. And what that does is, if you think about what porosity might do to translucency, it kind of breaks up our ability to see through that zirconia. So if you're able to remove that porosity, it actually makes that zirconia more translucent and improves the aesthetics of it. So this is something that is a game changer in the world of chairside zirconia, is the ability to, in a very short amount of time, not only sinter a zirconia, but sinter it in such a way that makes it more aesthetic. Total game changer. Really excited for what that will bring to all our practices. So as far as bonding zirconia goes, this is really, really important to understand that you can bond to zirconia. It's a very specific workflow that I'm going to talk about briefly, and it requires 3 steps: air abrasion, all right, an MDB primer, and then your adhesive composite resin. Okay, so that is basically the APC is the protocol. And if you don't have a particle air abrasion unit in your practice, I highly suggest getting these. I love my particle air abrasion unit, but it's really important for zirconia. And if you're not able to do this yourself with your chairside zirconia, you're going to have a hard time bonding this successfully to structure. Okay, so if you're ordering these from a lab, maybe you ask your lab to do this if you don't have an air abrasion unit. But if you're milling this in house yourself and you want to bond that restoration, you almost have to have a particle air abrasion unit. Okay, and what it does on teeth is phenomenal as well. So it's not just for preparing zirconia. It can actually does a really nice job cleaning teeth and helping get some of the scuzz off of restoration after you prep. So what does that look like when it comes to bonding zirconia? By the way, this is the same way you would bond those composite blocks as well. Well, you need to air abrade the restoration. What this does is it creates micromechanical retention. Okay, it's really, really important. The other thing about zirconia is that after you try it into the patient's mouth, it becomes contaminated. All right. If you don't decontaminate the zirconia with a product like Ivoclar, you are not going to get any bond strengths to that material. So really important to decontaminate it after you try it in. And then these are 10 MDB primers, and there's really 3 or 4 good ones on the market. One of these 3 is what I would recommend. But this is how you prime the tooth and get it ready. It's basically the same type of silane type agent that we use on the glass ceramic that facilitates the bond to that zirconia. And then the way we treat the tooth is the same: selective etch the enamel, universal adhesive, or whatever it is that you happen to be using for an adhesive, and our cement. Now, the other option for this is to use, if you have a relatively retentive prep, is to use SpeedCEM Plus. SpeedCEM Plus is a self-adhesive resin cement that will give you some bond strength to structure, maybe not as good as what you would get with your actual adhesive and a resin cement, but still a very, very good result if your restoration is semi-retentive. And then, of course, if your preparation is totally retentive, right, like we talked about before, you can just use a resin-modified glass ionomer like ZirCAD cement for that. So you have a lot of different options because of the strength of zirconia. You just got to know what that strength is and know what type of zirconia you are using. This is just a picture, and I like to talk about the differences in nomenclature between cementation and bonding, and understanding that cementing something with a RMGI luting cement does really nothing to help support the restoration itself. All it does is it provides some friction between your restoration and a retentive prep that you have created for the purposes of keeping that restoration on. When we bond, like we would with veneers, and this is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Amanda C's photograph that I'm stealing here. By the way, this is her office that I'm sitting in right now, so I don't think she'll mind. But when you're bonding ceramics to structure, it's a whole different ball game, and it takes a certain attention to detail, and it takes a certain knowledge of your materials. It takes great isolation, like you see in that photo as well. So really, really important to have all that to be successful when it comes to bonding those restorations also. So when we talk about the nomenclature, luting, self-etch bonding, and what I call legit bonding, it's really important to understand the pros and cons of all these approaches, and knowing that whatever your preparation is, right, is going to dictate what level of bonding or cementing that you're going to use. And that's going to go hand in hand with whatever strength material that you choose for that given case. So, I use eluting cement very rarely because that's just not the style of dentistry that I do. But a lot of us, and we'll do, retentive crown preps that have, great, perfect crown preps that don't need any help as far as retention. Our cement doesn't need to provide too much. So that's when eluting cement like an RMGI comes in really handy. For me, I'm at the bottom of this page. I'm using legit bonding. I'm, like I said, selective etching my enamel and using kind of the best materials to keep those restorations on the teeth. And a lot of literature that backs up and supports this approach to bonding. All right, we did it, guys. We got through. I appreciate y'all hanging out. And I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. By the way, this is downtown Charleston. I love dental photography. Almost all the pictures in that presentation are mine. I love to take photographs. This is the Pineapple Fountain in downtown Charleston. If you ever get a chance to visit Charleston, absolutely take it. It's a beautiful town, beautiful town.
It looks gorgeous. Thank you again, Dr. Mennito. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A section of your control panel. So our first question is from Alexandra, and she asks, how do you code or charge composite inlays or onlays?
That is a good question. So like I said, in general, and you have to kind of look at the material. So most of these materials have been categorized as hybrid materials, meaning there is some ceramic or glass content in them. So I think across the board, for the most part, and you need to verify this with whatever material it is you're using. Those are coded out as ceramic restorations. Okay, for me, the most of the time that I do those composites, I am going the other way, right? I'm billing them as direct composites rather than as ceramic options. But there are times when I will do an onlay with those materials, and because there is a certain amount of ceramic content, and I think the definition is that has to have, I don't know the exact percentage of ceramic in the composition of the material, but most of them do, that you can code it as a ceramic restoration. Okay, so that's a little bit of a gray area. I would definitely do some research for yourself to find out, so none of us gets in trouble. But for me, I usually, when I'm using those materials, I'm going the other way, and I'm kind of downgrading those materials. So I'm giving the patient an upgrade, actually, is how I would think about it. That's a very good question.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Alyssa, who asks, are we bonding the interior of the crown after primer? And this is for zirconia and glass ionomer.
So no, you are not. You mean, are you putting bonding agent on the internal surface of the crown? I think if I understand the question, you would not generally do that. All right. There are some people who will do that for veneers because it helps the cement to wet against the internal surface of the veneer a little bit better. But aside from that, you don't really need to do that. The exception for that might be composite materials. So what I always tell you is this: there's such variability amongst the materials, and the little variability in composition between materials can sometimes manifest in a difference of protocol. So if, for instance, if you're using Tetra CAD, if you buy a box or a couple boxes of Tetra CAD, look up the IFU, look up the instructions for use of that material, and it will very plainly state the regimen for treating that material. But that could be different than a different composite material that you might get from, say, Carrare or a different company. And so it's important. I mean, read the directions, right? I mean, it sounds simple, but that's the best advice I can give you, because there is enough variability amongst these materials that it's easy. It's hard to make blanket statements about how to treat them. Glass ceramics, yes. Glass ceramics, for the most part, the only way glass ceramics vary is the etching time. How long do you put the hydrofluoric acid on? That will vary. But for the most part, the way you treat those other than that is the same. Composites are a little bit different, so you got to be careful. So I would say, as simple as it sounds, read the directions.
Perfect. And then we have a few questions from Rick. So he asks, which air abrader brand do you like and which blasting, I think it's medium, is used,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
ALO2 or 50 micron?
Yeah, so basically we have 50 micron aluminum oxide, and we have the prep start in my practice. I love it. It and there's one called the AquaCare, which is very popular as well. Those are the two higher end options. Danville makes a micro etcher 2 that just connects to your handpiece on your unit. That is less expensive, but also very nice. I like the more expensive units because you can pick exactly the PSI level that you want for whatever you happen to be doing. So for ZIRCONIA, for instance, they recommend 40 PSI and no more than that, because there is a potential if you go sandblaster, right, you can damage the zirconia material and cause issues. So the Prep Start and the AquaCare are two that are always get really great reviews, and the ability to dial in exactly the pressure that you need is a huge advantage. But I use primarily 50 micron aluminum oxide. Very good question. I wish I had 2 hours for this. Maybe next time we'll do 2 hours.
Yeah.
Go into those details.
A part 2.
Part 2.
Well, perfect. Thank you again, Dr. Mennito, for the great presentation tonight. And thank you to Ivoclar for sponsoring this webinar. If
Absolutely.
anyone has any outstanding questions, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com. And as a thank you for attending, everyone will receive the recording via email in the next week. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on future webinars.
Corinne, can I say one other thing? You
Yeah,
can
of
also,
course.
you can always direct message me. My Instagram is up here as well. Feel free to direct message me with any questions. I'm usually pretty good about getting back and answering those, and I'm happy to interact with dentists. One of the great things about social media is our ability to interact with each other. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Mennito.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Have a great night.
Have a good night.